So we will have a long day, but I hope good day, that's like we all hope, to discuss about acting against sexual harassment in academic and research organization. My name is Nathalie William. I will be the trainer with Sophia. Sophia Street or Stride, I never know how you say, sorry, Sophia, I should have asked. I'm based in Belgium, Sophia is based in Sweden, and we will share the presentation of this session with our different perspective from country, but also from background. So I would like to go first to introduction of this training and expectation. As you know, this is part of the GE Academy program. So the GE Academy program has the goal to develop and implement a coherent and high quality capacity building program on gender equality in research and innovation. It's based on the state-of-the-art knowledge and expertise. So really it was developed before, really mapping what exists already in terms of training. We also provide tailor-made training material, and we are targeting different groups like decision maker, human resources, or equality or diversity officers, researcher, etc. And we were supposed to provide different formats. Obviously, with the pandemic, it changed a bit, but we were supposed to have in-person trainings, workshops, and webinars. So now these three are online. The in-person training is much more interactive. The workshop is more now based on a kind of round table type, and then the webinars just stay as they were. We have also summer schools. In fact, we will have 3 summer schools this summer. Well, the first one I think should be in May, but you will find all this information on the website. I will not go through this, but just for you to know that there are still 3 summer schools that will be taking place this year, and also a DOC, which is a distributive open collaborative course. We had one last year, and we will have another one, and it takes a format as it takes the format of a MOOC, if I may say. It's not really a MOOC, but same similar format, and it will take place during the summer. I wanted to say, in fact, that's a bit the problem is online, Okay. So for the agenda of the day, so we start with the welcome and introduction, then we will go straight to developing a common understanding of sexual harassment. We will follow this with an explanatory framework of sexual harassment and violence. We will have a short coffee break, and then we will start with sessions working in subgroups. One for mapping our existing policies. That we also have feedback in plenary. Then we will have a second session where we will be in subgroup working on how to improve our policies to combat sexual harassment at work and possible strategies, again, with work in subgroups and back in plenary. And then hopefully at 1 o'clock, we will have a lunch break for 1 hour. So that is as planned. So I hope it's fine for you. And then in the afternoon, we resume at 2 o'clock with a session on how to improve my policy to combat sexual harassment at work, and introducing the comprehensive approach to combat sexual harassment at work. And a last session in subgroups where we will discuss how you can tackle sexual harassment as a measures towards institution change. So really making the link between policies to combat sexual harassment and structural change. And then we will have a Q&A session, and then we finalize the day. So in terms of questions and answers, it's difficult. We are also quite we are now 25 participants apparently. So what we propose is that if you have a burning question in terms of comprehension of something that is said, please put this in the chat and we will address it. But if it's more, you know, kind of comments or something, yes, put it in the chat, and then at the last session we will try to answer as many as possible questions, or also provide some resources. And, you know, also for past trainings with people coming and putting some of their own resources, which is very interesting to share such different knowledges, and that we can also circulate after to all participants, all these welcome resources. Now, expectations. I mean, you have received an ex-ante questionnaire about your expectation for this training. As you know, when you register, you were presented with 3 main objectives for this training: discussing and providing example of intervention and policies is one of the objectives of this training. The second one is understanding sexual harassment as an expression of gender violence and power relations. And the third one is highlighting the importance of embedding sexual harassment policies in institutional structural change. Okay, what we see from the ex-ante questionnaire is really that people want to discuss and provide examples and get examples of intervention and policies. That's really the main thing that you tick. But so 13 people said that. 6 asked about said that the main objective is to understand sexual harassment as an expression of gender violence and power relation, and 2 about the link with the structural change. So not all of you have obviously participated to this ex-ante questionnaire, but that gives a sense probably of what you are looking for. And in terms of, you know, some of the ideas you express in terms of expectation, we had a lot on examples, you know, get examples of policies and intervention. Demystify or define sexual harassment, how to prevent, how to support, how to tackle, how to raise awareness, really the how to work on the cultural change, how to deal with resistance, how to pass a message to the leaders, to top leaders in your organization. So we will try really to address as much as possible all these expectation. One thing I want to say from the start is that there is not a perfect model that fits all for sexual harassment strategies and policies. So what is really important is that we today exchange and share some of our experience and difficulties to all come back with more ideas, being more efficient in our policies. Now, I would like to introduce you to the technique we will use. Apart from Zoom, we will also use Miro. Let's start now with sexual harassment and trying to get a common understanding, because that is one issue that is emerging from studies and survey, is that there is a lack of understanding of what constitutes sexual harassment. So it is really important that we agree on the type and the range, the huge range of behaviors that could constitute sexual harassment. So to try to get this common understanding, I would like to ask you in the Miro board, that's the next board that you have seen, to reflect first on an example of sexual harassment that you think of, and either you can write this on a virtual note or you can look for an image illustrating that and bring that to the board on understanding sexual harassment. So any type of behavior you think of, and you start each one with, as we have 30, I think if everyone just put one idea on the board, we will already have quite a range. Comments, way of treating and communicating, and behavior related to body appearance, gender roles that the harassed person find unwanted and uncomfortable. Yeah, it's quite comprehensive one. Unwanted sexual advance comments, sexually derogatory language, in particular salacious remarks or jokes. I mean, I've seen that. Think about jokes. Yeah, sexual jokes as well. I mean, there are a number of sticky notes with this idea of jokes, unwanted behavior, sexist jokes. There is also multiple manifestation from soft verbal to physical abuse. Yes, certain range, as you said, of manifestation. Physical touching, verbal approaches with a sexual background towards inferior colleagues. So here there is the idea of hierarchy between people, between the harasser and the harassed person. Comments on someone's body with sexual content, yes. Sexual nickname, commenting on other people's sexual orientation or practices, yes, indeed. This is important as well, to just say that this is not just about men and women. I mean, we have also to see this in a more intersectional way. Comment in work settings about how fun a single person, dating life, and sexual exploit must be. Yeah, also this can be insinuation of sexual relationship between young female and older male colleague. Yeah, sexual harassment is on the spectrum of harassment. In many cases, it is preceded by what we would call psychological harassment. I mean, this idea of range indeed is important. We'll come back to that. The type of very different from non-verbal to verbal to physical as well type of behavior. Senior scholar invited young scholar to office to lend her a book, cornering her, yes, groping her, trying to kiss her, yes. Then we have also abuse of power, yes, and this idea of power is also in the next one. Sexual harassment is about power more than sex, and also the image of Donald Trump, which received favorable comments. Then an image with all the different type of behavior. And we have an image there also with someone grabbing the shoulder. Yeah, and other example, grabbing by the waist while being behind and getting very close or too close. Yes, and unwanted flirting, jokes, calling, etc. Anytime. Yeah, I think we have already, as you see, a big range of behavior that you have identified, and also some important aspect linking it with the power hierarchy and the progression as well. So I will now go back to my sharing of the screen as a recap of this. Okay, yeah, okay, so what is important first is to say that harassment, and it was also in one of the notes, can be sexual or it can be based on sex and gender. So that's important to take into account. I mean, it can also be, you know, jokes on how you are dressed, or it can be really grabbing your waist. I mean, this is not the same. It can be physical violence. It can be sexual violence. I mean, physical without any sexual aspect, sexual violence, psychological violence, as you said, you know, like very denigrating comments on your capacity to do the work, for example. It can also be economic violence, like restricting access to financial resources, It can be verbal, it can be non-verbal images, it can be sexism, you know, even a benevolent sexism. It can also be online as well, because I mean, we think a lot of offline behavior, but obviously this is also increasingly taking place online. What I want now to say, and as mentioned by some of you, the behaviors are part of a continuum. I mean, this is also what we see with any types of violence, but certainly with sexual harassment, there is a tendency in some organization to say that, you know, it is not important, it's just a joke, or it was just once. It is really something very petty. You should not really react to this. It's a misogyny, but it's not really sexual harassment. But we know that in fact it's part of a continuum of violence. So obviously you will have more of this kind of sexist, homophobic, or transphobic jokes or problematic language that will be used. But all that is also leading to some behavior that are links to getting women, or less the case, but also sometimes men, to their traditional role. It is linked to all this discrimination that we can see within the workplace, like glass ceiling and rigid gender-based stereotypes that really lead then to what we in the common sense you will really see as harassment, as it's really a threat and a verbal abuse, and going to the more and the upper type of behavior, like violent behavior, like rape or sexual assault, or physical, emotional, financial abuse. Finalizing with murder, which you see quite a lot in domestic violence. As we know, there is unfortunately in every country a number of women who are killed by their partner or ex-partner. So I like the pyramid because it shows that, you know, it can start with a joke, but if you do not stop it, it can really go up in the pyramid in terms of the importance of the behavior. But it's also a continuum in terms of whether it's visual, you know, it's only leering, it's a sexual gesture, or it is really verbal, going to verbal, rough and vulgar humor, or bragging about sexual prowess, as one mentioned. Sorry. In terms of writing, it can just be, you know, oh, I'm writing a love poem, a letter. This is, you know, this is really nice, but in fact, no. I mean, because it can also be it can also lead to something different. I mean, it's about a way it's a power relation. It can also be obscene letters, notes, invitation. Touching, it's also from just hugging to really invading personal space, impeding or blocking movement. In terms of power, it can be demanding dates or sexual favors, to really requiring a person to dress in a certain way, or just be some would just say, yes, some paternalistic behavior, but that in fact are expression of power. And finally, it can be also sexual assault and rape. So all these two charts, I think, are important to express this idea of continuum and gradation, and the importance to really act, even if it's what can be considered by some as a very minor behavior that should not be sanctioned as such. Sexual harassment is a form of gender-based violence, and so that this really should be treated from the start. Now, in terms of specific forms in research performing organization of gender-based violence, sexual harassment, studies identified some specific factors that contribute to such violence in academia and research environment, like the elitist and excellence culture that can increase the problem. Also in terms of the fact that you will not report some cases. Also the asymmetric power relation, the hierarchical structures that make people then in relations where it's very difficult to really go against the person request and or to say stop it or no. This is about consent as well, the hyper competition and individualism that are valued. So again, do you want to say what you are experimenting on the workplace and then perhaps be seen as a weak person and not really hyper competitive? Short-term and precarious contract, it's certainly an important aspect that you see everywhere, but you know that this is very important. I mean, you have a lot of this type of contracts within academia and research organizations, the internship, the field work, etc. The working environment is also important. Maybe we will see that just after after this, but it's not just the office, it's also being outside of the office, so attending international seminars, PR events, etc., that put you more at risk of sexual harassment. You had also some studies that shows in certain fields really the normalization of sexism among students in campus. Can have that in particular in some of the campus, or the sections where you have very few women and a majority of male students. Now, I would like to go to the legal definitions of sexual harassment. I mean, we have a number of key instruments dealing with sexual harassment. So just what is in fact the definition we can find in the legislation? I mean, we have EU legislation that define sexual harassment in the directive relating to gender discrimination. And they define sexual harassment as any form of unwanted verbal, non-verbal, or physical conduct of a sexual nature that occurs with the purpose or the effect of violating the dignity of a person, in particular when creating an intimidating, hostile, degrading, humiliating, or offensive environment. So that's really an important definition that in fact was partly there on the screen as well. And in fact, the directive is also talking about sexual harassment, but also as harassment based on sex, where the definition is more or less the same. But it's unwanted conduct related to the sex of a person. Yeah, creating an intimidating, hostile, degrading, humiliating, or offensive environment. An important groundbreaking development was also achieved recently with the adoption of a convention by the International Labour Organization on sexual harassment. And also there is in fact a recommendation that accompany this convention. And that also says that the term of violence and harassment in the world of work refers to a range of unacceptable behavior and practices of threat, thereof, whether a single occurrence or repeated, that aim at result in or are likely to result in physical, psychological, sexual, or economic harm, and includes gender-based violence and harassment. So this is really important. I mean, we will go back to this, but there you see already this idea of unwanted in the EU definition, unacceptable, also that it has the purpose or the effect. In terms of the gender-based violence and harassment means violence and harassment directed at person because of their sex or gender, or affecting person of a particular sex or gender disproportionately, and include sexual harassment. So you have the proper, if I may say, sexual harassment that is really connoting with sexual reference, but you have also harassment that is linked to gender and the sex of the person. What is important in the ILO Convention is that it also provides a wide understanding of what do we mean by at work. Because sometimes, you know, when you have a policy, you are focusing on what is happening at the workplace. But in fact, the convention says that you should understand at work by it's just a workplace, including public and private spaces. It can also be places, it is places where the worker is paid, but also take a rest, a break or a meal, or the uses of sanitary, washing and changing facilities. I mean, you can have this type of behavior, or also of harassing someone in such facilities. During work-related trips, travel, training, events, or social activities that we have mentioned as well, through work-related communication, including those enabled by information and communication technology, so referring to the online, offline aspects, in employer-provided accommodation, because that can also be that, you know, as you will have an accommodation that is provided by your workplace, or when commuting to and from work. So you see that really the place of work should be very encompassing all type of situation. So as I said, there are some key elements of the legal definitions that we see. First, it's unwanted. And the unwanted is from the victim perspective. You know, that the argument of the author to say, I did not want to harass her, I mean, it's not a valid argument. We have to think from the victim perspective. With the word harassment, sometimes some people just think it should be repeated, but in fact, a single occurrence can be enough. It can be a single occurrence or repeated. It can be from a superior, as we also mentioned before, but it can also be a colleague or even a client, a third party. It violates the dignity of a person, but also quid pro quo situation where a favor or an advantage is granted, and or where sexual harassment is a condition of the job. You know, if you make some reference to the fact that you will get the job or a more permanent contract if you are nice with me, this is obviously the type of behavior that is constituting sexual harassment, creating an intimidating, hostile, degrading, humiliating, or offensive environment. That is, again, from the perspective from the victim. I mean, that this really creates an hostile, offensive environment. So for some, you can say that displaying an image of a nude women on the wall is not a problem, but for some others it will be, and so that will be considered as offensive environment and harassment. And it covers, obviously, all the forms of violence we have mentioned before. I don't think ILO Convention was signed by all EU countries. I mean, there will be a report soon on this. I'm not up to date. It has been signed by some countries, obviously. And what is important, yeah, so thanks for the question, because it reminds me that is an information that is also worth sharing with you, is that the European Commission, in fact, is considering to adopt a directive on gender-based violence. So that's important.
How could the victim prove those less apparent signs of sexual harassment, such as visual and touching and power?
Yeah. Yes, exactly. That is something that we will discuss. I think this is an important aspect and an important barrier. I think that here we wanted just to make sure that we understand the same way what constitutes sexual harassment, but when we will map our policies and also look at what is partly challenges, certainly the burden of proof is one of those. So thank you. We can consider to have one of the work we will do on challenges to have that one.
A final clarification, or maybe a question that we will return to, but that is, how do you define the difference between sexual harassment and harassment at work that isn't sexual?
Yeah, okay. So sexual is really about, of a sexual nature, and harassment at work. Yeah, I mean, you mean in a broader sense, so not sexual harassment nor harassment based on sex and gender, if I understand correctly.
That's how I understand the question,
yeah. Yeah, I mean, obviously harassment can be completely different than sexual harassment and based on sex, but here the focus is on harassment that is really linked to gender and sex. But yes, you are right. I mean, the different elements are the same. And in the legal definition, in fact, if you look at the definition outside of the scope of the gender directive, for example, you will have harassment, mobbing. The terms, the type of elements of it are the same. And the only thing, perhaps, but that is a first reaction, is that the harassment, in a more general term, generally means more repetition than sexual harassment and harassment based on sex. But yeah, it's the same type.
I will say something about prevalence and the forms of sexual harassment that we see in employment, and I'll give you some data on research on sexual harassment in RPOs, or research performing organizations. And the first thing to say, if you move to the next slide, this is just some data on different forms of sexual harassment in employment that comes from EGE, the European Institute of Gender Equality, and their report Sexism at Work. It shows that the majority of the forms of sexual harassment are in terms of intrusive questions about the employee's private life. So asking questions that might be too intimate or too private. The second most common form is sexually suggestive comments or jokes. And the third most common form is inappropriate invitations to go out on dates or dinners, or to do things together that is not appropriate in an employment environment. The least common form is inappropriate advances on social networking websites, which I find quite interesting, seeing the weight and the new research on online forms of violence and violations, which is taking over quite a lot in the research area. But in looking at statistics, that's still not a very common form of violations or harassment. The next slide is complicating things a bit. It is telling us, when we ask the question of how much sexual harassment can we find in research performing organizations, a recent review of 74 European studies showed a variation between 17 and 81% for women in academia, in RPOs. It's quite a wide range, reflecting the problems in measuring and the problems in defining sexual harassment. Another review performed by two Swedish colleagues at the National Secretariat of Gender Research in Sweden showed that after looking at 802 high-quality peer-reviewed international articles, between 11% and 73% of heterosexual women, this focus on heterosexual women in academia, had experienced some form of sexual harassment. So the range is vast, and the main problem that they identify in this review is definitions of sexual harassment, that we mean different things in different countries, and different people experience sexual harassment differently, and therefore they also see themselves or report themselves as a victim/survivor of sexual harassment, because we have different ideas about what it is. There's also in this review, they identify that there's a large gap between disclosed levels and reported levels. So when we do surveys asking women, have you experienced some form of sexual harassment, and we give them examples of what that could mean, the result is that much higher than if you look at the number who actually report being subjected to sexual harassment. So this gap between experienced violence, sexual harassment, and reported sexual harassment. A third interesting thing to note in these studies is that countries that tend to have high levels of gender equality in general often report very, very high levels of sexual harassment and gender-based violence. This is, by some researchers, been called the Nordic paradox, and it shows how the Nordic countries with very high levels of gender equality in employment, in education, in income, in parental leave, and so forth, also show very, very high levels of gender-based violence and sexual harassment, hence the Nordic paradox. And this can obviously be a reflection of the different interpretations and different understandings of what we mean by violence and sexual harassment. So there's a wider range of activities and a higher capacity to say stop or report in countries that are otherwise seen as more gender equal than in countries that are less gender equal, is the speculation here then. Specifically from the RPOs, the specific forms of sexual harassment that are being suggested as comment include gender offensive behavior, sexual harassment based on sorry, ignore that. You have the slide, that was the earlier slide that showed all these forms we presented, so maybe I don't need to read that out again. Actually, we'll skip that. The next slide.
Sorry.
There's something about how...
No.
Oh, that one.
Yeah, so. Yeah.
Thank you. What the pandemic has done to both gender-based violence and sexual harassment as a form of gender-based violence, and there's been a lot of reports on increased levels of harassment and violence, and women and other minoritized, women and marginalized groups are being subjected to higher levels of all forms of gender-based violence, including sexual harassment. But one of the main problems that has appeared during the pandemic is the lack of capacity to report. So being stuck with the person who is harassing you means that you can't report and you can't ask for help, you can't get any support structure. So COVID-19 has significantly complicated the picture of sexual harassment and gender-based violence. And this also means that women are more often stuck in the same space as their harasser. And therefore you can't really report to anyone or ask for help. I see that there's a question there. If sexual harassment is linked to power and Nordic women are gaining more power, it could also be explained by that. There's a theory about the backlash, if that's what the question refers to, where it's seen as this comes, it's part of how we understand masculinity and the power of gender relations, where it's seen as when women gain more power, men then take the last resort to prevent that is violence of some form or harassment. So yeah, certainly it can be linked to power. Should we go to the next slide?
Sorry.
That's all right. I want to say something about, to connect to some of the things that Natalie has already mentioned, but explaining violence and sexual harassment and explanatory frameworks. So the next slide will say, I position two large frameworks, and I'm going to give you an unfair presentation of these explanations because I will pull them apart in the way that they become extreme. because it's easier to then understand what is the actual basis of the explanation here. So what I call conventional biocriminology or biosociology, and also some forms of psychology, often examine sexual harassment from an individual perspective as a predominantly physical act with a measurable impact, where there's a link in time and space between the act and the impact. So harassment will be seen as a direct act with a measurable impact that you can almost see a physical effect of. And this means that these conventional, I hope that there are no criminologists or psychologists who get upset with me doing this, but bear with me. So when conventional criminological and psychological explanations of sexual harassment and violence are based on some form of individual deviant factor, like maladjustment, marginalization, minoritization, psychopathy, alcoholism, social exclusion. So that means that the perpetrator position and the person who is the perpetrator is seen as relatively marginalized or vulnerable or socially misadjusted in these explanatory framework. And where sociological frameworks, non-feminist sociological frameworks, have focused predominantly on class, it means that explanations of sexual harassment end up in the social exclusion camp, from as if the direction of harassment goes from the relatively marginalized and powerless towards those relatively powerful and relatively privileged. Now, neither of these work very well to explain harassment in RPOs, because perpetrators are not generally socially marginalized, they're not generally socially misadjusted. Whether or not they're psychopaths or alcoholics, that's a different story, but that doesn't fit with the class hypothesis that we see from the sociological frameworks. Because the perpetrator, the harasser, is quite often the manager, the line manager, your boss, your male colleague, with somebody who's actually in a relative power position towards you. So feminist violence studies and feminist studies on sexual harassment, they reverses the direction of violence and instead argues that harassment and violence goes from the relatively powerful towards the relatively powerless. So the harasser is explained through a framework of power. People with power have the capacity to harass those without power. People who are privileged have the capacity to harass those who are not privileged because, well, in part, they get away with it. So feminist perspectives analyzes the direction of violence from the powerful to the powerful, and feminist intersectional perspectives of harassment and violence shows how the perpetrator position consists of a set of structural privileges, for example, in terms of economics, employment, language, social networks, ethnicity, migration, and so forth. And feminist studies or feminist violence studies link, it's all right to change that, link these to notions of patriarchy, gender regimes, gender discrimination, and the wider concept of gender-based violence. So violence and harassment in a feminist, from a feminist perspective or a feminist understanding, will explain and see harassment as part of patriarchy, as something that is people with power and privilege have the capacity to perform towards those who don't have it. So feminist violence studies again then examine harassment from the social, societal perspective, and it situates violence as well as other processes and relations in the middle of a gender regime, i.e. in the middle of a system of social relations and institutions where inequalities, opportunities, and obstacles are based on gender.
One issue we discussed before the coffee break that I want to come back, perhaps, this question about difference with harassment. And just to tell you that, in fact, in Belgium, we have seen that a lot of victims now use the ground of harassment instead of sexual harassment to file a complaint, because obviously it's probably not less connotated. I mean, they feel much more comfortable in using just harassment and not sexual harassment. And in fact, that's also linked to what Sophia presented about prevalence, you know, it can be that some cases that would be reported under harassment there then are in fact sexual harassment or harassment based on sex and gender. So that's just one point I wanted to say. Okay, so policies against sexual harassment. We will now, this end of the morning, we will really try to go into working on policies and try to exchange on what we have and how we can do better. So we understand policy in a broader sense. Policy it's a coherent course of action or a set of rules that is followed by an individual or an organization to deal with a certain type of situation. But that can be not really recorded, that can be informal, that can be recorded in a policy document, that can be a plan, that can be in a law. I mean, we really understand policy here in a broader sense. We would like to exchange really on what exists as practices in your organization. We are aware that there are very different types of actions you can take in your university or in your research organization to combat sexual harassment and harassment based on sex and gender. It can be a formal statement from the university saying that it will be not tolerated. It could be more on collecting data on cases. It could concern an audit to identify risk, and also some attention with to intersection aspects that will reinforce risk of sexual harassment, some vulnerabilities, some link to also LGBTIQ plus aspect, characteristic, the age, the working place environment and all that, you know, really all these things about auditing your risk in your working place. It can also be just raising awareness actions toward the staff or certain categories of the staff. It could be really a training on sexual harassment, again, for some staff like human resources department or people in charge of victims, etc. It can be informal, formal. I mean, there is a wide range of formal, informal ways to report case, etc. From a victim perspective or witness perspective. So now we had to make a choice, and we want really to discuss with you the policies that are in place, either formally or informally, to support the victim in our institution. I mean, we think that is really important that we start from that perspective of what is in place or how a victim would do if she experiences harassment. What are the steps in your policy, in your organization that she will have to follow? Who is involved at each of these steps? And then identify critical aspects and challenges for the victims. We have identified already some before, like, you know, the kind of issue of getting proof of what you are reporting. We have identified some problems. So what we want now is to see together in our groups how we can improve our policies. We have identified some challenges. So we would like to see what are possible solutions. Thanks, Juliette.
So policies need to be implemented bottom up from the side rather than top down or from the outside in order to be, according to research, be seen as efficient. And finally, the policy process itself, I mean, how we create these policies and strategies, they need to have a very strong mandate from senior management. They need to have resources allocated, and they need to be facilitated by what is seen as legitimate and active case managers. Now, this is a long list of what policies need to have in RPOs in order to be efficient. But interestingly, and a bit problematically, is that even though there's a vast number of journal articles recommending the use of policies as a core preventive measure against sexual harassment, there's almost no evidence-based research on the actual effect of policies on, for example, decreasing the prevalence of sexual harassment. So we don't have data or evidence, I'm using quotation marks for those of you who can't see me, the flicking of the fingers in the air. There's basically no evidence saying that policies in themselves can decrease the prevalence of sexual harassment. And there's actually nothing to suggest that any further efforts to strengthen the impact of policy on sexual harassment, through, for example, information, increased information, more communication, revising policies and so on, but that will at all change the underreporting, the policy awareness, or the reporting of behaviors, sexual harassment behaviors as such. So the importance of policy is quite paradoxically highlighted in research, and it puts us in a bit of a weird situation, because we are here to discuss how can we improve and strengthen policy in order to reduce sexual harassment in RPOs, and then the research coming out of the RPOs tells us that policy doesn't matter. There's no evidence base saying that good policy can lead to a decrease in the actual sexual harassment. So we have a problem. So what do we do then if we're here to discuss policy and improve it? Well, if you go to the next slide, there's always hope, obviously, but what we put our hope to is this holistic 7Ps model, where we move away from policy itself and we still tease out 6 other Ps, where policy becomes one of many measures. So, for example, the conventional approach to gender-based violence and sexual harassment is the 3P approach, with prevention, protection, prosecution. The Istanbul Convention adds a 4th P as policy. So the 4P approach is prevention, protection, and policy and prosecution. What the 7Ps approach does is that it adds partnership and provision of services in specific areas to adopt measures and strategies within. So prevalence is, have I not put prevalence on the slide? Prevalence should be on the slide as well as the main important P. Prevalence and incidence, obviously, as we know, estimates data collection, and they contribute to some form of reasoned and comprehensive and coordinated policy making. If we can't see a link between policy making and prevalence, we have a problem with our policy. And this, I think, relates to what you did in the Lotus Blossom this morning, when you listed one of the groups listed surveys as a way of making the problem visible, and also not only measuring, but as a way of almost, I think, awareness raising. Prevention obviously refers to measures to promote change in the social and cultural patterns of the behavior and attitudes of employees, and it could include awareness raising initiatives or the development of educational materials, the training of professionals, as suggested this morning, perhaps training for all new staff, or potential requirement to become a new employee, and also to link this to policy on recruitment and promotion, that without this training, maybe promotion is not possible. The protection P, the primary objective there is to ensure the safety and to meet the needs of the potential victim survivors. And it comprises cooperative actions to protect potential victim survivors of any form of sexual harassment. And it includes enabling the reporting of the occurrences of potentials for abuse and harassment. So here we saw this morning a few different suggestions on whistleblower functions, or the anonymous complaint procedure, up until 3 anonymous complaints, that would lead to taking an issue forward, the potential of suspensions and other things that you listed on your on the Lotus Blossom. Prosecution, we didn't talk all that much about, perhaps because that's sort of beyond our scope, but that would be the way to think about prosecution beyond within our scope, is to think of disciplinary measures, so that somebody could actually be removed from the research group, or be taken, a grant could be taken away from them if it turns out that they are repeatedly harassing their co-workers. Provision of services refers to services offered to both victims, survivors, and perpetrators of sexual harassment in universities and research organizations. So it can cover professionals who provide these services, I mean, those involved in specialized training, and it can cover the existing tools, so guidelines and learning materials, to assist these in better understanding the needs of the target groups. So, and why not, as you suggested this morning, also for bystanders, there can be provisional services for bystanders to be equipped to better discover and see cases of sexual harassment or incidents of sexual harassment. Partnership in the holistic 7Ps model relates to the involvement of multiple relevant actors at both sort of at all levels throughout the organization. So what you talked about here this morning in terms of partnerships, or what I think you talked about this morning, was the collaboration between, for example, HR departments and research centers, specifically working on sexual harassment or gender-based violence, or that area, whether it be in gender studies or law or sociology. And then we have the final P, the problematic P, which then is the policy, which refers to in this model, it is the whole coherent set of measures of the 7Ps with a clear vision, and it needs to have a comprehensive strategy to respond to problems of sexual harassment in a holistic and integral way, i.e. what we are here to deal with. And I'll leave that with this little question mark then, because of the problematic lack of evidence that policy make a difference. Probably not what you want to hear, but there it is. Can change slides. Is there any, before we move on with the next area, are there any questions specifically on the 7Ps model? And it comes from some work the Yellow Window did a few years ago, on a study on, I can't remember now if it was gender-based violence in sports or if it was FGM and the risk of FGM. So, but if you Google 7Ps approach and Yellow Window, you will find a report talking about this in more depth, and it will also describe even better than I can do the potential use and the potential advantages of thinking more holistically around sexual harassment and gender-based violence.
Now, starting with our last session, we will now really look at our third objective, which is to link sexual harassment measures and structural / institutional change. I mean, we have seen, and we know that inequalities persist in workplace, because gender inequalities are really embedded in our organization. And so it is important when you work on sexual harassment or harassment based on gender and sex to look at really the systemic norms and structures that permits and perpetuate the gender nature of the workplace. So that's really what we want to discuss with you. One aspect I would like also to just briefly mention is that sometimes when you do some training on gender equality and in fact inequalities and certainly sexual harassment, you have people that deny that there are still gender inequalities because we are in gendered organization, and you have some I mean, it's a bit more subtle type of gender bias and discrimination. We cannot address this in the training, but obviously the Gender Equality Academy is addressing that as well. You know, what type of bias we can have in terms of norms and types of prejudice that a bit reconstructing, in fact, inequalities within a workplace. So about institutional change, what do we mean? Institutional change is a strategy aiming at removing the obstacles to gender equality that are inherent to the research system itself and adapting the practices of the organization. The main objectives of institution change are to, according to the Commission, to enhance women's representation and retention in scientific careers and to promote the integration of the gender dimension in research and innovation. Really, the Commission is placing the fight against gender inequality and towards better gender equality within institutional change with these objectives of retention of women in and representation in scientific careers. You can see all the work done with the she figures, for example, but also promote the integration of the gender dimension within research and innovation. The tool used that is recommended by the Commission to work on a structural institutional change is gender equality plan. And what is a gender equality plan? I mean, it includes a set of actions. So it can be, as we have mentioned that already, conducting audits of procedures and practice to identify gender bias, to identifying and implementing innovative strategies to correct any bias, setting targets and monitors progress via some indicators. So this is really important to see that a gender equality plan is not just some the adoption of a general objective towards fostering gender equality, or a broader strategy or plan including a gender dimension among others. It's really for the Commission. It's really important that we stay focused on the gender equality dimension. The type of intervention that are mentioned as being part of a GEP, gender equality plans, are organization culture, reconciliation of work and private life, recruitment, selection and career progression, leadership and decision-making, sexual and gender-based harassment, but also integration of a gender perspective in research. So what I would now like you to do, but I don't know how I can launch the pool now. So what does it mean to address sexual harassment from an organizational perspective? You know, looking at really a bit forms of violence and how, in fact, your organization perpetuate gender inequalities and gender-based violence. Really, what we want to say here is that the focus, it should be on the organization and not on women. When we are talking about addressing sexual harassment from an organizational perspective, obviously this is the focus change from women to the organization. It should also go beyond a formal gender equality in institution. I mean, you have, as I said before, I mean, you have sometimes the remark that we have achieved gender equality, that there are more pressing issues now. But I mean, when you start to look at and so that, you know, if you are harassed, it's not about power. It's not this type of issues of gender inequalities. The gender inequality is not at the root of it, but we know that this is what research shows us, and practice is that really the roots of violence are this imbalance in power relation and gender inequalities. It requires a transformation of the organizational culture. I think you have mentioned that in your different exercise quite a lot. It really implies a systemic and integrate and long-term approaches on how you tackle violence. And that the issue is not to tackle only individual practices and look at this from an individual perspective, you know, like the bad boy. It is really about what is permitted in your organization. Important as well to see it in a holistic way, so that it's not just for employees, but it's staff, academic and support staff, and as well students that are facing sexual harassment. And there are some studies also looking at sexist culture in campus. Importantly, also looking at organizational perspective means that you have to look at intersectionality and see what are the determinant factors that will affect your experience of or higher chance to be sexually harassed, like age, human and social capital, academic status, migration status, and also sexual orientation, etc. So this is really also important to look so from a broad perspective, bearing in mind, however, that each institution has its unique a bit culture and factor and history. And so there is not, as I said before, there is not a kind of one way to solve the problems everywhere, but it's really needed to go deep into the institution and the way it is organized and functioning. Obviously, and that was also one aspect, it's not in the slide, but that's one aspect you mentioned also, that it should be coming from should be a high commitment from the hierarchy on dealing the engagement to deal with any type of sexual harassment and harassment based on sex and gender. Is there any, I mean, this is a bit of a quick preview because we have also some training, obviously, that are more really on structural change, but I want that we discuss now in our subgroups the link between your the policy, or even if there is no policy, how you can make it much more structural. I think that's also an influence really institutionally the way the institution function. I think that was one clear message also from our work in groups. So is there any question on this?
How to approach the study of the culture of an institution, and what aspects should we pay attention to? How do you study culture of an institution? So one thing that I would look at would be, what are the decision-making procedures? Who gets to speak? Who gets to be heard? Which to me then, suggests something about norms of gender norms, so masculinity norms, femininity norms. That would be one part of the culture of an organization. But I'm not sure if you have something else specifically in mind.
Well, I think that in the culture, I don't know. I mean, I think you will study also the way, because you mentioned decision making, but there are the formal and the informal process. I think there is. I was thinking, for example, how you get the information in an organization. What are the informal channels to be informed? I mean, that's an important way to put people aside if they are not part of some sport clubs or not going for a drink after work. I mean, there are things like that. I think it's also in the way, probably in the way you run your meetings, and you organize your meetings. Do you have a very hierarchical way to conduct this, or do you have a very transparent process? And I think that's also linked to decision making. In fact, that you make sure that everyone is informed about what will be discussed, what will be the process, then also what are the decisions. I see that as part of culture.
There's an interesting Swedish study on organizational culture and what they propose to do. I mean, to sort of really see the you know, the underlying norms and attitudes and beliefs and values that somehow build the culture or is the culture. What these researchers suggest to do is to study study what is not study what's not seen. You know, in order to see what is the norm, you need to study what stands out. So you can't really study the norm because it's invisible. But when a behavior or an attitude or something is seen as unacceptable, then you can start understanding what the culture is, because it is what that isn't. So you have to study the opposite. So that could be, you know, one way to sort of see the culture is to study what stands out. So if sexual harassment cases do not stand out, if you don't see them, if management says that there are no cases of sexual harassment, then obviously sexual harassment is part of the organizational culture because we can't see it. So to study the things that stand out, then you can see what the norm and the cultural norm.
Yes, and you can see it in very different aspects. In fact, in all the areas we have mentioned as possible areas of intervention, we can have a look, you know, in the way you approach work-life balance, for example. It's also cultural norms, and I mean, yeah, there is potentially, you should look at all aspects identified.
It's also a comment saying that you can see it in the images of the website and the visibility of women in internal events, in PR material and brochures, which I think is a very good point. Just looking at university, Örebro University, there used to be on all the web pages were these young youth, successful, white, middle class looking kids. They were sort of the representative image of Örebro University. That's what Örebro University wanted us to be, which is obviously then saying that the rest of you don't bother. So yeah, very, very.
Sorry. We have half an hour to see a bit how this could be linked in principle, sexual harassment and organization change. And we had prepared a board with the link between what type of policy you have already in place, what is in the JEP, and how you can reinforce this. So if so few of you have a JEP, that's probably a bit more difficult to do this as exercise as such. But I think it is still interesting to reflect on the link between sexual harassment potential. Because I remember that for some also there was not a lot in place, potential policies or practices, and what is considered in the organization as fields of intervention when dealing with gender equality. Okay, so any more comments, reaction? How to deal with the resistance? Yes. That's a big issue. It's also, I mean, for dealing with resistance, in fact, you have to identify the type of resistance. You know, you have different types of resistance. You can have very active resistance, but you can have also a more subtle one. You know, people saying I will do and they will not do. So yeah, in fact, there are trainings delivered by the GE Academy on resistance. I think this is really an important subject, but yeah.
I think that in Sweden, Gothenburg University and Lund University are seen as the two. There's a question about universities and research organizations with good policies and practices.
Yeah.
Lund University and Gothenburg University, and they've got brilliant international websites. They are seen as the most radical, in a positive way, obviously, when it comes to plans and policies. And in particular, what they do, at least what Gothenburg does, is that they allocate massive resources to gender equality, and they place sexual harassment and gender-based violence under gender equality. So there's a lot of resources allocated to work with the issues. So, and they also, what they do is they do what a lot of organizations try and do, and that is to mainstream the work into the day-to-day activities, and at the same time have a separate individual structure that is dealing with gender-based violence and sexual harassment in academia. So they have a dual approach. So rather than having one center or one institution or one unit working on these issues, trying to get into the day-to-day activities of the organization, the the activities are also mainstreamed in the already existing activities.
Mhm. Yeah.
And that's there's a book by Mika Ferlou called "Varieties and Opposition to Gender Equality in Europe," where a few of the are trying to summarize resistance, in particular how is resistance formulated, and how can we deal with it, and how can we oppose resistance, or how can we resist opposition to gender equality. And then the sexual harassment is part of the gender equality framework. But that's quite an interesting book with lots of different contributions from different countries and contexts. Mika Ferlou.
Yes.